The morning Violet Rhodes arrived in Caldwell, Kansas. The wind was blowing so hard off the prairie that it nearly took her hat clean off her head, which she would later think of as an omen, not of bad luck, but of everything in her life that was about to be upended in the most extraordinary way. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell had earned itself a reputation as a rough and tumble cattle town sitting right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, the last real outpost before the Indian Territory stretched south into an unknowable wilderness. The streets were wide and muddy from a recent rain, the boardwalks crowded with cowboys who had come up from Texas with the longhorn herds, their boots caked with red clay, their faces burned brown from months under an unforgiving sun. There were saloons on three corners of Main Street, a barber shop, a general store, a small white church that looked slightly embarrassed to be standing between two establishments that sold whiskey, and a land office with a crooked sign above the door that swayed in the Kansas wind like it could not quite make up its mind about staying put. Violet was 24 years old, with dark hair that she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed straw hat, and eyes the color of summer thunderclouds, gray-edged with the faintest violet, which had prompted her mother to give her the name in the first place. She had come to Caldwell from St. Louis with her uncle, Herbert Rhodes, who had recently acquired a parcel of land outside of town and who intended to run cattle on it. Her parents were both gone, her father to a fever that had swept through their neighborhood 3 winters prior, and her mother to grief not long after, as though her heart simply refused to continue operating without her husband inside it. Violet understood that kind of devotion even then, though she could not have known how soon she would begin to understand it from the inside. Herbert was a stout man with a red face and a genuine good heart, but he knew very little about cattle and even less about Kansas, and it showed in the way he walked into the land office that first morning with a roll of papers under his arm and a nervous expression on his face, as though he expected someone to inform him he had made a terrible mistake. Violet walked beside him, carrying her own small carpetbag and wearing a traveling dress that was too heavy for the warming Kansas weather, her cheeks flushed from the wind, her gray-violet eyes taking in everything around her with the careful attention of a woman who had learned that the world offered very few second chances, and so it was best to observe it closely the first time. The land office smelled of pipe smoke and old paper and something vaguely like horses, even though there were no horses inside it. A man named Caldwell, no relation to the town's founder, he was quick to clarify, sat behind a desk and spread maps across it with the enthusiasm of a man who truly loved maps above all other things. He traced the boundaries of Herbert's property with a tobacco-stained finger, explaining that the eastern line ran along a dry creek bed. The western line was marked by a row of cottonwood trees that someone had planted about 30 years prior, and which were now quite tall. The northern boundary was clear enough because it abutted the road to town, and the southern line was where things got complicated. "That southern boundary," Caldwell said, pausing with his finger pressed to the map as though the paper itself might argue with him, "runs right up against the Whitfield spread, Edgar Whitfield's outfit. He's been ranching out there going on 6 years now. Good man. Honest. But that southern line has been disputed before, and you'll want to get it settled before you run any cattle." Herbert nodded with the expression of a man who was writing a word on a piece of paper inside his mind so he would not forget it. He glanced at Violet because Violet was better at remembering things than he was. "Whitfield," she said quietly, looking at the map. "Edgar Whitfield," the land office man confirmed. "You'll find him easy enough. His spread starts right where those cottonwoods thin out going south. He usually rides his property in the early mornings. Big bay horse. Can't miss him." They found a room at the boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Donahue, who was a widow of indeterminate age with an iron constitution and an extraordinary talent for making cornbread. The boarding house had 6 rooms, a parlor with a piano that nobody ever played, and a small dining room where the boarders ate together in the evenings. There were currently 3 other boarders. A young schoolteacher named Agnes Pell, who had come to Caldwell optimistically and was beginning to doubt her optimism. A cattle buyer from Chicago named Harold Finch, who wore a suit that was too nice for Caldwell and seemed to know it. And a drifter named Creed, who said very little and ate a great deal, and seemed to be waiting for something without being sure what it was. Violet settled into her room, which was small and clean, and had a window that looked out over the back lot, where Mrs. Donahue kept a kitchen garden in varying states of success. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to Caldwell humming and jangling around her, the sound of horses on the street, the occasional raised voice from one of the saloons 2 blocks over, the distant lowing of cattle being pushed through on their way north, the wind working its way through every gap it could find in the clapboard walls. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something more interesting than afraid. She was on the edge of something, and she could feel it the way you can feel a storm coming before you can see it. A certain electric quality in the air that makes every sense you have sharpen and stand at attention. The next morning, Violet rose before Herbert, who was not built for early rising, and borrowed one of the boarding house's horses, a reliable gray mare named Sugar, from Mrs. Donahue's small stable out back. She rode out south of town as the sun was still making up its mind about whether to commit to the day, the sky going from a dark plum color to a deep rose along the horizon, the prairie stretching away in every direction in long golden waves, the grass bending in the wind like it was taking a bow. She had the map from the land office in her memory and a general sense of where Herbert's property started and ended, and she wanted to see it for herself before her uncle woke up and began making decisions that would need to be corrected. She found the row of cottonwoods easily enough. They were tall and elegant, their leaves catching the morning breeze and turning silver green and back again in a constant shimmer, and they marked the western edge of Herbert's land with a quiet certainty that she found reassuring. She rode along the northern boundary next, which indeed ran alongside a rutted track that passed for a road out here, and then she turned south and rode along the eastern edge, where the dry creek bed wound through the grass like a sleeping snake. The land was good. She could see that. The grass was thick and healthy. There were no obvious rocky stretches that would be hard on cattle. There was a slight elevation on the northern end that would give a house a fine view, and in the distance, she could see where a stand of trees clustered around what might have been a natural spring or a reliable wet-weather creek. She was standing at what she estimated to be the southeastern corner of Herbert's property, trying to figure out exactly where the southern boundary ran, when she heard hoofbeats. The horse came from the south, a tall bay, just as the land office man had said, and the man on it was riding easy, the way a man rides when the horse is his, and the land is his, and the morning is his, and there is no particular hurry about anything. He was broad across the shoulders and lean everywhere else, wearing a faded work shirt of dark blue denim, canvas trousers, and boots that had seen so much use they had molded themselves entirely to the shape of his feet. His hat was brown and well-shaped, pushed back slightly on his head in a way that made his face visible, a good, strong face, weathered and honest, with dark eyes under dark brows and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who was serious about the project. He was perhaps 28 or 29, Violet thought, though the sun had a way of adding years to men out here. He pulled up his bay horse about 20 feet from where she sat on Sugar and regarded her with an expression that was curious but not unfriendly. "You're on the Whitfield spread," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, with the faint traces of somewhere south of here, Texas, she thought, or maybe Arkansas. "I'm on the Rhodes property," she replied with equal calm, "unless the southern boundary is where I think it is, in which case I'm standing exactly on the line which I would argue is nobody's property and everybody's." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile but the intention of one. "You'd be a Rhodes then. Violet Rhodes." My uncle, Herbert Rhodes, has just acquired this land. She paused because she was a woman who believed in accuracy. Or rather, he acquired it some months ago but has only just arrived to take possession of it. Edgar Whitfield, he said, and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers in a gesture so natural it seemed less like a courtesy and more like an instinct. I know, she said. The land office man told us about you. He said there's been a dispute about the southern boundary. Edgar Whitfield swung down from his horse with the fluid ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times. He was taller than she had realized, though he moved in that unhurried, almost quiet way of men who were used to being in large open spaces and had no need to announce themselves. He ground-tied his bay horse, which stood perfectly still, ears forward, regarding Sugar with polite interest, and walked to where he'd been riding, crouching down in the grass and pushing it aside with one hand. "Come look," he said. It was not an order. It was simply an invitation, stated plainly, and Violet stepped down from Sugar and tied her to a nearby fence post that marked the edge of someone's idea of where a boundary should be, and walked over to where Edgar was crouching. He pointed to a flat stone that had been placed in the ground, one side of it marked with a crude X that had been chiseled into it by someone a long time ago. "Survey marker," he said. "There's another one about a quarter-mile west. The line runs between them, and it runs about 20 feet north of where most people assume it does, which means a strip of land that my previous neighbor thought was his was actually mine, and I imagine whoever sold your uncle his property was working off old assumptions rather than actual survey stakes." Violet crouched beside him and looked at the marker. "And you're telling me this?" "I am," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That doesn't serve your interests." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was someone who chose his words with some care, not because he was unsure of them, but because he had learned to respect the space between speaking and being heard. "I've got enough land," he said finally, "and I'd rather have honest neighbors than extra acreage." She stood up and looked out across the prairie, where the rising sun was now fully committed to the day, painting everything in shades of gold and copper. "I appreciate that," she said. "My uncle is going to need all the honest neighbors he can get. He's a good man, but he's new to ranching." "I figured as much," Edgar said, and there was nothing unkind in the observation. He stood too, and they were both standing there at the edge of the Whitfield land and the Rhodes land, the morning wind moving the grass around them, the horses standing companionably nearby, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable at all. It was the kind of silence that belongs to people who are still getting the measure of each other. "I'll have my uncle speak to you about the boundary," she said. "We should document it properly." "I'll be here," Edgar said. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and she looked back at him with her gray-violet ones, and for just a moment the morning held very still around them. She rode back to town thinking about the way he had crouched in the grass to show her the survey marker, unself-conscious and practical and completely without pretension, and she could not quite account for why that simple gesture had stayed with her the way it did. Herbert and Edgar sorted out the boundary dispute with a minimum of fuss, which surprised Herbert considerably, and which Violet had expected from the moment she met Edgar Whitfield, who struck her as a man not much given to fuss. They hired a surveyor who came out from Wichita on the afternoon train, spent 2 days walking the property lines with a level and a transit and a notebook, and produced a document that confirmed exactly what Edgar had told Violet that first morning. The southern boundary of the Rhodes property ran 20 feet north of where previous assumptions had placed it, giving Edgar a strip of good grass that had, by rights, always been his. Herbert accepted this with good grace. Edgar accepted it with no celebration whatsoever, which Violet respected. What happened next was simply that Herbert needed help. He was a man who had made money in St. Louis in the dry goods business, and he had a practical mind for commerce but very little idea of what to do with 300 acres of Kansas grassland and the 40 head of mixed cattle he intended to purchase. He hired 2 Hands brothers named Holt and Sam Bricker, who were competent and reliable, but he still needed guidance on things he did not even know enough about to ask questions about yet. Edgar offered that guidance without being asked for it, which was the kind of person he was. He appeared at the Rhodes property one morning about a week after the survey, leading a mule loaded with a good roll of wire and a set of fence posts, and he showed Herbert and the Bricker brothers how to sink the posts properly and tension the wire right, and he explained which pastures should be rotated and when, and he drew a rough map of where the natural water sources were, and which ones were reliable in dry years and which would disappear in August. He did all of this with the casual thoroughness of someone doing what needed doing, and he never once made Herbert feel foolish for not already knowing it. Violet watched him from the porch of the small house on the property, which had been built by the previous owner, and which she and Herbert had been cleaning and fixing up for the past week. She told herself she was simply trying to learn what he was teaching, because she had decided to be useful out here, and that meant paying attention to things. She watched the way he explained things, patiently, without condescension, with the occasional dry joke that made the Bricker brothers grin and Herbert chuckle. She watched the way he worked, efficiently and without wasted motion. She watched the way he looked at the land, which was the way you look at something you love not possessively, but with a kind of reverent attention that acknowledged there was more to it than you could ever fully see. In the evenings, sometimes, he stayed for supper. Mrs. Donahue had relocated herself to the Rhodes property to keep house for Herbert and Violet, an arrangement that suited everyone, and she fed anyone who was present with the magnanimous indifference of a woman who always cooked too much food and saw no reason to waste it. Edgar ate supper with them perhaps twice a week, and these meals stretched into long evenings on the porch, where Herbert asked questions and Edgar answered them, and the conversation ranged from cattle prices in Wichita to the politics of the Indian Territory to the curious social arrangements of a cattle town, and Violet sat in the porch rocker and listened, and sometimes contributed, and sometimes argued, because she was not a woman who could be quiet when she disagreed with something. And she had discovered early in their acquaintance that Edgar Whitfield appeared to consider being argued with not as a provocation, but as a form of honest engagement. "You think women ought to have the vote?" Edgar asked her one evening about 3 weeks after her arrival, his long legs stretched out in front of him, his hat resting on his knee. "I think women ought to have everything men have," she said without hesitation, "including the right to decide who governs them." Herbert shifted uncomfortably, because he was a kind man but also a conventional one. Edgar looked at her with that steady, measuring regard. "Wyoming Territory gave women the vote in 1869, he said, "and the world hasn't ended yet as far as I can tell." She had not expected that. "You agree with me?" "I don't see a sensible argument against it," he said. "Half the people I know who manage their land best are women. Seems odd to tell them they can decide how to run a ranch but not how to run a territory." Herbert made a noncommittal sound and looked at the stars. Violet looked at Edgar for a long moment in the warm evening dark. "You are not like I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" she considered. "I'm not sure. Something rougher, perhaps, or more certain of itself without reason." "I've got plenty of certainty," he said. "I just try to make sure it's earned." She went to bed that night turning that sentence over in her mind like a smooth stone you find in a creek, feeling the shape of it from every angle. The trouble with Caldwell, as with most cattle towns at the height of the trail drive season, was that it attracted all manner of people along with the legitimate commerce of the cattle trade. The summer of 1882 was a busy one on the Kishom Trail, and the herds moved through in a steady parade of noise and dust, and behind them and around them moved the commerce and the chaos that always accompanied moving cattle buyers and sellers and gamblers and men who were difficult to categorize. There was a saloon keeper named Hicks who ran a dishonest game of cards in the back room of his establishment, and there were 2 brothers from Missouri whose relationship with the law appeared complicated, and there were assorted other characters whose intentions toward peaceful coexistence were ambiguous at best. The trouble for Violet came on a Thursday afternoon in late June, when she had ridden into town to pick up a supply order from the general store. She was loading sacks of flour and salt and cornmeal into the wagon when a man stepped up beside her who smelled of whiskey and had the particular purposefulness of someone who had been gathering courage through liquid means. His name was Darrell Cobb, and he had arrived with one of the Texas herds and had decided, for reasons he probably could not have fully articulated, that Caldwell was where he intended to stay. He was not a dangerous man so much as a foolish one, and foolishness and whiskey produced in him a confidence far exceeding his wisdom, and he had apparently formed an impression of Violet that she had done nothing to encourage and everything to discourage. "Let me help you with those," he said, reaching for a flour sack she was perfectly capable of lifting herself. "No, thank you," she said, and kept loading. He persisted in the way that foolish, whiskey-emboldened men sometimes did, and it was going poorly for everyone when Edgar appeared around the corner of the general store with a natural timing that could have been coincidence and might not have been. He did not do anything dramatic. He simply walked up to the wagon and took a position beside Violet in a way that was unhurried and entirely deliberate, and he said, "Morning, Cobb," in a tone of voice that was pleasant and completely unmistakable in its meaning. Darrell Cobb looked at Edgar for a moment, appeared to do a rapid internal calculation, and decided that his business elsewhere was more pressing than he had previously realized. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and walked away with the slightly over-dignified gait of a man pretending he was leaving because he wanted to. Violet lifted her last sack of cornmeal without looking at Edgar. "I could have handled that." "I know you could have," he said, and he picked up the sack anyway and settled it in the wagon with the others. "I was getting a nail from Hartley's and I saw the wagon. Thought I'd walk you back since I'm headed that direction." "You're not headed that direction," she said. "Hartley's hardware is on the other end of town from my uncle's property." "I'm efficient," he said. "I can go multiple directions in one trip." She looked at him then, and he looked back at her, and there was something happening in that space between them that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, which was, she suspected, why neither of them was trying very hard to name it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're welcome," he said, just as quietly, and climbed up to the wagon seat and picked up the reins, and she climbed up beside him, and they rode out of Caldwell in the bright Kansas afternoon with the kind of comfortable silence between them that has to be built over time and cannot be rushed. Agnes Pell, the schoolteacher at the boarding house, had become Violet's closest friend in those first weeks in Caldwell, and it was Agnes who said it plainly one Sunday afternoon when they were sitting on the boarding house porch drinking sweet tea and watching the street. "Mr. Whitfield looks at you in a particular way," Agnes said. Violet kept her eyes on the street. "He looks at things carefully. He's that kind of person." "He looks at things carefully," Agnes agreed pleasantly, "but he looks at you considerably more carefully than he looks at fences or cattle or the horizon." Violet smoothed her skirt. "Agnes." "I'm just observing," Agnes said, with the serenity of someone who has made an accurate observation and knows it. "He's a neighbor," Violet said. "He's been kind to my uncle, that's all." Agnes smiled into her tea. "If you say so." Violet said so firmly and changed the subject and tried very hard not to think about the specific quality of Edgar Whitfield's attention when he turned it in her direction. The summer progressed in the way that Kansas summers do, hot and intensely alive. The sky enormous and changeable, going from brilliant blue to thunderhead purple with very little warning. The lightning storms at night spectacular and terrifying in equal measure. The daytime heat something that had to be accommodated rather than fought. The cattle drives continued through Caldwell, and the town's character shifted accordingly, louder and more volatile in the evenings, quieter and harder working in the mornings. Herbert's cattle arrived from a cellar south of town and settled into the pastures without too much drama, and Violet threw herself into the work of the ranch with an energy that surprised the Bricker brothers, and seemed to please Edgar when he came around to check on things, which was often enough that Violet had stopped pretending to herself that his visits were primarily about Herbert's welfare. One evening in July, a fierce storm rolled in from the west with the fast, black-shouldered urgency that Great Plains storms had, and caught Edgar at the Rhodes property when he'd ridden over to help Holt Bricker repair a section of fence that had come down. The rain hit before anyone could do anything sensible about it, and they all crowded into the small barn, while the lightning split the sky in great white forks, and the thunder rolled over the prairie like something enormous rolling over in its sleep. They sat in the barn on upturned crates and bales of hay, listening to the rain hammer the tin roof with an intensity that made conversation nearly impossible. And so they sat in a companionable shared silence, Herbert dozing against a hay bale with the philosophical acceptance of a man who has made peace with things beyond his control, the Bricker brothers playing cards by the light of a lantern, and Violet and Edgar sitting close enough that their shoulders would have touched if either of them had moved 3 inches in the other's direction, which neither of them did. In a brief lull of the rain, Edgar said, "What was St. Louis like?" She looked at him, surprised by the question. He was looking at the rain coming through the barn door, his hat in his hands, his dark hair damp at the temples. "Busy," she said, loud. "There's always something happening and not much of it is peaceful. I thought I liked it until I got out here and discovered that what I'd actually liked was the idea that somewhere there was more sky than this." He turned to look at her. "More sky than Kansas." "I mean sky you can belong to," she said, and she was not sure she had articulated it perfectly, but something in his expression said he understood it anyway. "In the city you're always underneath things, buildings and smoke and other people's business. Here you're just out in it, all of it." "I've never lived in a city," he said. "I grew up in Arkansas, then Texas, then I came here. Do you miss Texas?" He thought about it, which she had noticed was something he always did when he was asked a question, actually thought about it rather than producing the first convenient answer. "I miss the country sometimes," he said. "But Texas wasn't mine the way this is mine. I came here with nothing and I built what I have out of what was here, and that makes it different." "Yes," she said, and she understood that perfectly because she was in the process of doing the same thing, building something from almost nothing in a place that still mostly felt like it belonged to the wind and the grass. Outside, the storm renewed itself with enthusiasm, and they sat together in the warm lantern-lit barn while the rain thundered on the roof, and Herbert snored lightly against the hay, and the Bricker brothers disputed quietly over their cards, and Violet thought that there were far worse places to be than here, right here, in this small circle of light with this quiet, careful man beside her. She did not sleep that night, not really. She lay in her bed and listened to the last of the storm move east, the rain becoming gentle and then becoming nothing at all, and she stared at the ceiling and had an honest conversation with herself about what she was feeling, because she was a woman who believed in honesty, even with herself, especially with herself. And what she was feeling was specific and clear, and it had a name, and the name was Edgar Whitfield. The problem was that she did not know if she was building a friendship or something else, and she did not know how to ask without disrupting what they had, which she had come to value more than almost anything else in her new life here. He was careful and steady and kind, and he argued with her and listened to her and treated her intelligence as a given rather than a surprise, and she had never in her life met a man who did all of those things simultaneously. She also did not know, and this was perhaps the more complicated part, whether he felt what she felt, or whether she was building castles in the open air of her own wishful thinking. August arrived like a sentence being concluded with finality, hot and dry and certain of itself, the creek bed on the eastern boundary of Herbert's land going properly dry for the first time all summer, the grass in the lower pastures going pale and then gold. Edgar helped the Bricker brothers move Herbert's cattle to the higher pastures where the grass held better, and he brought over a load of stored hay from his own supply, with the casual practicality of a man who did these things not because he expected anything in return, but because they needed to be done. There was a community gathering at the church one Saturday in August, a potluck dinner and a barn dance afterward, which was a regular feature of Caldwell's social calendar, and provided an occasion for the more settled residents of the area to be social in a context that did not involve whiskey and cards. Mrs. Donahue made her cornbread, and Herbert brought a jug of good cider, and Agnes Pell brought an apple cake that everyone admired, and Violet wore her best dress, which was a deep blue-gray that matched, though she did not consciously intend this, the particular color of her eyes on a cloudy day. Edgar came in his cleanest shirt and his second-best hat, and when he saw Violet across the church yard his whole face changed in a way that was so unguarded and immediate that Agnes Pell, standing beside Violet, made a small satisfied noise into her cider cup. "Agnes," Violet said. "I didn't say anything," Agnes said serenely. The dancing was the old square dance style, with a caller who had been doing this for 30 years and could call a pattern in his sleep. And the music was a fiddle and a banjo, and occasionally a harmonica when the banjo player needed to rest his fingers. Edgar asked Violet to dance in the direct, unembellished way he did everything, and she said yes in the same spirit, and they danced through 2 full sets before the caller took a break, and neither of them let go of the other's hand in quite the deliberate way you would if you were genuinely indifferent to the holding. After the dancing, they walked outside to where the heat of the late summer evening was more bearable than the heat inside the church barn, and they stood at the edge of the churchyard where the lamplight became the moonlight, and Violet looked up at the sky, which was doing that extraordinary thing it did out here on clear nights, filling itself with stars from one edge of the horizon to the other until it seemed less like a sky and more like a revelation. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Edgar said. She looked at him. In the moonlight his face was all clean planes and shadow, his dark eyes holding the same steadiness they always did. "Then ask," she said. But he was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars the way she'd been looking at them, and when he looked back at her, it was with an expression she had not quite seen on his face before. Careful, yes, as always, but underneath the carefulness something that was asking a question it was not yet ready to put into words. "Not tonight," he said. "Soon." She understood this, or thought she did. There was something building between them that was not ready to be spoken yet, and they both felt it, and there was a certain sweetness in the still unspoken quality of it, like the moment before a storm when the air goes green and still, and you know something significant is coming. She slept better that night than she had in weeks. The first days of September brought a slight easing of the heat, the mornings coming in cooler, the afternoons still warm but without the brutal certainty of August. The cattle drives were winding down as the season tipped toward fall, and Caldwell began to take on a quieter character, the cowboys drifting back south, the saloons doing less business, the streets calmer in the evenings. Herbert's cattle were doing well, the fence lines were solid, and the house had been improved considerably by Violet's patient attention over the summer. New curtains, a repaired porch, a kitchen garden that had produced tomatoes and beans and a surprising amount of squash. It was on a cool September morning, the light coming in at a lower angle now and making everything look slightly golden and considered, that Edgar rode over to the Rhodes property and asked for Violet. Herbert met him on the porch, and Violet heard Edgar's voice from the kitchen where she was making bread, that deep, unhurried drawl, and she felt something lift in her chest like a bird startling off a fence rail. "I thought she might want to walk the property line with me," Edgar was saying when she came to the door, drying her hands on her apron. "I want to point out a few things before winter. Good to know the land before the first snow changes everything." He was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, his hat in his hands, his bay horse tied to the fence post. He looked up when she appeared, and his expression did that thing it did, that small, involuntary shifting toward something warmer. Herbert looked at Violet. Violet looked at Edgar. "All right," she said. "Let me get my hat." She came out of the house in her good walking boots and her wide-brimmed straw hat, and she told Herbert she would be back by noon, and Edgar saddled a horse from Herbert's stable for her. Not Sugar, but a steady bay gelding named Copper who had good feet and an easy manner. And they rode out together in the September morning, the air smelling of cooling grass and distant wood smoke from somewhere, everything around them touched with the first faint suggestion of autumn. They rode south to the boundary line first, where the survey markers were, and Edgar showed her where he had posted new markers at regular intervals, so the line would never be in dispute again. He explained this without fanfare, as though it were simply a practical thing he had done because it needed doing, and she understood that he had done it in part for her uncle's benefit, and in part, she thought, for hers, because she was the one who rode the property and she was the one who needed to know it. From the southern boundary, he turned them east, following the property line along the dry creek bed, which in September had the appearance of a place that was resting and gathering itself for the return of water. He pointed out the places where the bank had eroded and would need attention in the spring when the water came back, and he showed her a spot where the bed widened into what would be a natural water hole when things were running again, good for cattle. They rode along the eastern edge of the Rhodes property in the gentle September sunshine, and Edgar talked about the land the way he always talked about things that mattered to him, steadily, carefully, with a quality of attention that made everything he described feel important. He pointed out a ridge on his own property that provided windbreak for both spreads in the worst of the winter storms. He showed her where a family of foxes had denned in the fall and spring for as long as he could remember. He pointed to a particular section of sky to the south where, he said, you could sometimes see a hawk that had been hunting these fields for years, identifiable by the irregular spread of one wing where an old injury had healed imperfectly. As if summoned by the mention of him, the hawk appeared, a broad red-tailed hawk, riding a thermal in long, lazy spirals, that characteristic uneven set of the wing tilting it very slightly to the right as it wheeled against the blue sky. "There he is," Edgar said quietly, and there was something in his voice when he said it that made Violet look at him instead of the hawk. "You've watched him for a long time," she said. 6 years, Edgar said. "Since I came here, he was already old when I found him. Hawks live a long time if they're lucky." He was quiet for a moment. "I like knowing he's out here. Makes the land feel like it belongs to more than just me." She turned this over in her mind and held it carefully, because she thought it said something essential about Edgar Whitfield. They turned north from the northeastern corner of the property and began the long ride along the northern boundary, back toward where the road to town ran. The morning was warming now, the sun fully committed, and they rode with an unhurried ease that felt entirely natural, the horses moving comfortably at a walk, the grass on either side of the track rich and still mostly green at this height. Edgar began talking about what she would need to prepare for winter, the hay stores, the wind protection for the stock, the importance of making sure the water lines from the house's cistern did not freeze, practical things, useful things, the things you needed to know to survive a Kansas winter on a working ranch. But as he talked, Violet found herself doing less listening to the specific content of what he was saying and more attending to the quality of his attention, because there was something different about the morning, something in the way he was moving through it that was careful and deliberate in a way that went beyond the practical task of showing her the property line. He kept glancing at her. Not obviously, Edgar Whitfield was not an obvious man, but she caught it, the way his gaze moved to her and stayed a beat longer than information sharing required, and then moved back to the land ahead of them. She caught it the third or fourth time he did it, and she began to pay closer attention to everything. He stopped the horses at a point along the northern boundary from which the entire Rhodes property was visible. The house, the barn, the fenced pastures, the line of cottonwoods on the western edge, and to the south, beyond the boundary markers, the beginning of his own land rolling away in long undulations to where his own house and barn stood. He sat for a long moment, looking at it all, and Violet sat beside him, looking at it too, and waited. "It's good land," he said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, simply, and meaning more than the words themselves. "It is," she agreed. "Runs well with mine," he said. "The water from the creek serves both spreads when it's running. The wind breaks on the western edge of my property protect this whole northern section. The grazing rotations work better if they're managed together." She looked at him. "Are you suggesting we jointly manage the properties?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned to look at her, and she saw in his face something she had not seen before in quite this open quality, a kind of terrifying and complete sincerity, the face of a man who has set down every protection he habitually carries. "I'm suggesting something more than that," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for 2 months." The air went very still around them, the way it goes still on the prairie just before something significant happens. "Edgar," she said, and her voice was soft. "I love this land," he said. "I've loved it since I first saw it. But riding it alone for 6 years is a particular kind of loneliness that you don't notice until you find yourself not wanting to be alone in it anymore." He looked at her steadily, those dark eyes completely unguarded. "Since you came, I've been writing these lines differently, thinking about what it would mean if they were ours instead of mine and yours and your uncle's. Thinking about—" He stopped and appeared to gather himself. "I'm not good at the poetry of it. I only know the plain version." "The plain version is fine," she said, and her heart was going at a pace that she was quite certain was visible in some physical way, though she hoped it was not. "I want you to have this," he said, and he took something from his shirt pocket and held it out to her. It was a ring, a simple gold band with a small dark stone in it, and she recognized the stone as something she had seen before or thought she had, and then she realized it was the same deep gray-violet color as her eyes. "I had it made in Wichita in July," he said. "I sent away the description of it in June." She stared at the ring in his palm. June. He had been carrying this intention since June, and she had been sitting on his porch in the evenings and riding beside him and arguing about the vote and standing in storms in barns and dancing in the churchyard. And all along, since June, he had been holding this. "I was walking you the property line," he said. "Because if you say yes, it's your line too. Every marker and every dry creek bed and every hawk in the sky and every fence post I've ever sunk. I want it to be yours. I want you to know it the way I know it. I want—" He stopped again, and something that was almost a smile moved across his face. "I want a great many things, most of which I don't have the language for, which is frustrating for a man who generally believes in saying things plainly." Violet Rhodes sat on Copper the Bay gelding in the September sunshine, with the entire spread of land she had come to love visible in every direction around her. And she looked at the man beside her, this careful and steady and unhurried and honest man who had been walking her around a property line for 3 hours, and she had thought it was a neighborly thing, had thought it was a practical thing, had not understood until this exact moment that every step of it had been a question being prepared. A question that had been building since the very first morning they stood at a survey marker in the grass, and he told her the truth about the boundary without any reason to do so, except that he was the kind of man who told the truth. "I didn't realize," she said. Her voice was not quite steady, but it was close. "I didn't realize until just now what you were doing, what you've been doing this whole morning." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry if it was too indirect." "It wasn't too indirect," she said. "It was exactly right." She paused. "It was so entirely you that I should have seen it coming and I didn't, and I think that means I've been so determined not to build hopes that I missed what was actually being built." "Violet," he said. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes. Yes, Edgar." She looked at him very directly with the full clear weight of her gray-violet eyes. "I love this land too. I've loved it since that first morning when I rode out alone to see it, and you came over that rise on your bay horse. I've loved it more every day since. And I think I have thought, for some time now, without letting myself think it in words, that I love the man whose land runs alongside it." He reached over and took her hand in both of his, and she felt the rough warmth of his hands, the hands that had sunk fence posts and repaired wire, and guided her through an explanation of everything she needed to know to live here. And she thought that these hands were among the most honest things she had ever encountered. "May I?" he asked, and he held up the ring. "Yes," she said again, and her voice was completely steady this time. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had always been there, and the stone caught the September light and looked back at her in that particular gray-violet color that was the color of her own eyes. And she understood that he had been seeing the color of her eyes all the way back in June, when he had sent the description to Wichita, which meant he had been looking at her very carefully for longer than either of them had said. She pressed her other hand over his where it still held hers. "You walked me the whole property line," she said, with a soft laugh that was also almost something else. 3 hours. "And I thought you were showing me where the water goes in spring." "I was," he said. "I was also asking you to marry me. You might have mentioned it earlier." "I wanted you to know the land first," he said. "If you're going to say yes, I want you to know what you're saying yes to, all of it, every dry creek and every hawk and every winter fence line." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had understood, without being told, that she was the kind of woman who needed to see a thing clearly before she could commit to it, who had understood this well enough to show her every inch of the land she would be committing to before he asked, who had been patient and honest and steady for every single week of the time she had known him. "I know what I'm saying yes to," she said. He looked at her, and something in his face went quiet and complete and deeply certain, the way the prairie goes quiet after a storm when the sky clears to that particular bright blue that looks like the world has been washed new. They rode back to the house side by side, and when they came around the cottonwood line, and the house came into view with Herbert sitting on the porch in his usual afternoon chair, reading whatever correspondence had come from St. Louis that week, Violet could not quite keep the smile from her face, and Edgar could not quite keep it from his either, which was notable because Edgar Whitfield was not generally a man whose expressions ran to visible. Herbert looked up, looked at Violet's face, looked at Edgar's face, looked at the ring on Violet's left hand catching the afternoon light, and set down his correspondence with the expression of a man who has not been surprised so much as confirmed in something he had been quietly expecting for some time. "Well," he said. "Well," Violet said. "About time," said Herbert, and got up to shake Edgar's hand and then hug his niece. And if his eyes were somewhat brighter than usual when he stepped back, nobody pointed this out. They were married in October, at the little white church in Caldwell that Violet had noticed on her first day in town, the one that had always looked slightly embarrassed between the saloons. It looked considerably more confident on the day of the wedding, decorated with the last of the autumn wildflowers that Agnes Pell and Mrs. Donahue had gathered from the fields that morning, bunches of goldenrod and prairie aster arranged in mason jars along every surface, giving the small interior a warm gold and purple light that Violet thought was entirely appropriate. Agnes was her witness, wearing her best dress and alternately crying and trying to look as though she was not crying. The Bricker brothers came scrubbed to an unusual brightness and wearing their Sunday clothes, and they stood in the back with the slightly dazed expressions of men who are genuinely pleased about something, but are not sure exactly how to stand while being pleased about it. Harold Finch, the cattle buyer from the boarding house, had extended his stay in Caldwell by 3 weeks on some pretext of business, and attended the wedding with the air of someone who had been waiting for a happy occasion and was glad this one had arrived. Creed, the drifter from the boarding house, was gone. He had drifted away sometime in September, which was apparently what he did. Mrs. Donahue sat in the front pew and wept with the uninhibited enthusiasm of a woman who has been hoping for this outcome since approximately July and is not embarrassed about her investment in it. The minister, a man named Reverend Hale who had performed possibly 200 weddings in Caldwell over the years and had a practiced assessment of which ones were likely to last, looked at Edgar and Violet standing together at the front of the church and had the particular satisfied expression of a man performing a ceremony that he felt confident was going to stick. Edgar held her hand through the whole thing, which she had not expected. She had expected him to be formal, formal being a reasonable interpretation of careful. But he held her hand with the uncomplicated certainty of a man who has made a decision and is completely at peace with it. And she held his back, and they said what needed to be said in clear, steady voices. And when the minister said they were married, the small church burst into an enthusiasm of applause that seemed slightly outsized for its occupants and entirely appropriate for the occasion. Outside, under the October sky, which was a hard bright blue with a few mare's tails of cloud high up, Herbert pumped Edgar's hand with the vigor of a man who has been reduced to good cheer by the occasion, and Agnes hugged Violet so long that it became clear she was actually crying, and had given up the pretense that she was not. The Bricker brothers managed the complicated social maneuver of congratulating their employer's niece's new husband, who was also something of a mentor and authority to them, and came out of it with reasonable dignity. Mrs. Donahue had organized a dinner at the boarding house that evening that was, by any measure, extravagant for Caldwell in 1882. There was roast chicken and potatoes and gravy and cornbread, and 3 kinds of pie and a genuine cake, white layered and somewhat lopsided, but decorated with such evident care that nobody would have dreamed of mentioning the lopsidedness. They ate and talked and laughed until the October evening came in through the windows, and then Violet and Edgar rode out together to the Whitfield spread. Their spread now, though they would continue to manage Herbert's neighboring property as well, because Herbert needed the managing, and the night was cold and bright and full of stars. The Whitfield house was larger than the Rhodes house, and had been built with some permanence in mind, good timber, solid construction, a wide porch that faced east to catch the morning sun, 2 bedrooms and a parlor and a proper kitchen, with an iron stove that Edgar had clearly spent real money on, because he understood that a kitchen was an important room. He had cleaned and aired everything out in preparation, and there were fresh curtains that she recognized as the work of Mrs. Donahue, who had clearly taken this project seriously. Edgar lit the lamp in the parlor, and Violet stood in the middle of the room and looked around at everything, the solid walls and the warm light and the view of the porch, and beyond it the vast dark prairie spreading out under the October stars, and she felt something settle in her, with the finality and rightness of something finding exactly the place where it belongs. "I want to add a room next spring," Edgar said, "and I thought the north fence line could be extended to take in that lower pasture. The water access is better there." She looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking at her in the steady way he had. "Edgar," she said, "we have been married for approximately 6 hours. "I know," he said. "Perhaps the fence line can wait until tomorrow." The corner of his mouth moved. "The fence line can absolutely wait until tomorrow." She laughed and crossed the room, and when she took his face in her hands and kissed him properly for the first time without an audience, the lamp flickered in a draught from somewhere and the shadows danced on the walls, and outside the Kansas night was cold and enormous and full of stars, and inside everything was warm. Winter came to the southern Kansas plains with authority and a great deal of snow, which Edgar had predicted and prepared for with the thoroughness of a man who had survived 6 of them. The hay stores were deep, the livestock were sheltered, the water lines were insulated, the firewood was stacked on 3 sides of the house in a solid wall, and the pantry was full. When the first real blizzard came in December, it found the Whitfield spread entirely ready for it, which it seemed to take as a personal affront and doubled its efforts accordingly. They were snowed in for 4 days during the worst of it, and Violet spent the first day thinking she would find this difficult, and the second day discovering she did not find it difficult at all. They read together in the evenings by the fire, Edgar with his almanac and cattle records, and Violet with the books she had brought from St. Louis, and the ones she had ordered from a catalog in Wichita. They talked more than they had even in the evenings on the porch, because there was more time and no audience, and the fire made everything feel like a room with a door closed between them and the rest of the world. She learned things about him that you only learn in long, uninterrupted proximity. She learned that he could not abide a poorly organized shelf, that he had a habit of waking very early and lying in the dark thinking before he was ready to start the day, that he was an unexpectedly good cook of the limited category of things he cooked, that he laughed more than she had realized because it was a quiet laugh that didn't announce itself, that he had a habit of touching her hair when he walked past her in a domestic and entirely unconscious way that she found devastating in the best possible sense. She told him things she had not told anyone. About her parents, about the particular quality of her mother's grief after her father died, about how Violet had sat with her mother in those last weeks, and understood for the first time that love on that scale was both the most dangerous and the most necessary thing a human being could do. About how she had come to Kansas not quite running from grief, but needing to put distance between herself and the shape of it, and finding instead a life she had not imagined and a man she could not have predicted. He listened to all of it without filling the pauses, which was one of his finest qualities. On the third day of the blizzard, he came in from checking on the livestock with ice in his beard and his cheeks bright red from the cold, and she had coffee hot and waiting, and he sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at her across it with an expression of such uncomplicated gratitude and love that her heart, which was not a small or fragile thing, turned over completely. "I've been thinking about the north pasture fence," he said. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You always think about the north pasture fence when you're sitting with your coffee and looking at nothing in particular," she said. "You'll get that particular focused look, and I've noticed it corresponds to the north pasture fence every time. You made a note about it in your almanac twice last week." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she was learning to read as a particular form of pleasure, the pleasure of being known specifically by someone who has paid you the attention of genuinely watching. "I want to extend it in spring," he said. "I keep mentioning it." "You mention it regularly," she agreed. "I think we should extend it." "You do." "I think the lower pasture with the better water access makes sense, as you said on our wedding day. I've ridden it twice since, and the grass is good and it's sheltered by your ridge on the west. It's a good idea." He put his coffee mug down and looked at her. "You've been thinking about it too." "Of course I have," she said. "I live here. I'm paying attention." He was quiet for a moment with that almost smile at the corner of his mouth, and then he said, "I am the luckiest man in southern Kansas." "You are very lucky," she agreed pleasantly, "and so am I, and I think we should both acknowledge that and then go back to arguing about whether we need more chickens, because I think we do and you've been resistant." "We have enough chickens," he said. "We could always have more chickens," she said. They argued about the chickens with the comfortable enthusiasm of two people who are not actually arguing at all, and the fire burned warmly behind them, and outside the snow came down in white curtains across the prairie, and the Whitfield spread sat solid and warm in the middle of it all. They did, in the spring, get more chickens. Violet chose them herself from a neighbor named Paulson who kept a fine flock, and she came home with 8 new laying hens in a crate in the wagon, looking very satisfied, and Edgar accepted this outcome with the good grace of a man who has married a woman with strong opinions, and has wisely decided this is a feature rather than a problem. The fence line was extended too, in a long 4-day project in April when the ground had thawed enough to sink posts, and Violet rode the new line with Edgar on the day they finished it, checking every post and every stretch of wire in the warm spring sunshine. And she thought about that September morning, when she had ridden this land for the first time with a different purpose, and had not understood what was happening. And she thought that there was something very fine about being a person who could look back at a thing and finally see it whole. Agnes Pell left Caldwell in the spring of 1883, which was a sadness to Violet but not a surprise. Agnes had been increasingly clear through the winter that Caldwell was not, in the end, the right place for her ambitions as a teacher, and there was a new school being established in Newton, Kansas, with a proper building and a salary that reflected something closer to what teachers were actually worth. Agnes came out to the Whitfield spread to say goodbye on a morning in late April, and she and Violet sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked for 2 hours with the easy depth of women who have become genuinely fond of each other. And when Agnes left, she hugged Violet with great sincerity and looked at the ring on her finger and said, "I told you so," which was entirely fair. And then she was gone in the stage toward Newton, waving from the window with her handkerchief. The world moved around them in the way that the world does, never quite settling, always rearranging. But the Whitfield spread held its own kind of steadiness, a center of things. Herbert grew more confident in his ranching through the year, and by the spring of 1883 he was managing his own property with real competence. The Bricker brothers a dependable operation, and he had even taken on a third hand, a young man from Missouri named Davis who was eager to learn and did so quickly. Herbert remained a fixture of their evening's dinner 2 or 3 times a week, the old habit of supper on the porch, though now it was the Whitfield porch rather than his own, and he sat in the rocking chair that had been transported from the Rhodes porch and declared its permanent home here, and he read his correspondence and occasionally offered unsolicited opinions about cattle prices, and he was happy. In the fall of 1883, Violet told Edgar that they were expecting their first child. She told him in the morning, before the day had quite gotten started, sitting across the kitchen table from him with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, watching his face. He received the news with a stillness that she recognized as the way he received things that mattered very much. He simply went still with it, holding it, giving it its full weight before he responded. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and his expression was so completely open and without defense that she felt her eyes sting, which she blinked away promptly because she was not, generally, a woman who cried at the table in the morning. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. He pressed her hands gently. "Good." He went out to the barn after that, ostensibly to check on the horses, and she watched from the kitchen window as he stood in the barn doorway for a long moment with his hands in his pockets looking out at the morning. And she thought from the set of his shoulders that he was having a quiet private conversation with the sky about something, the way people do when a thing is large enough that you need to look at something large while you hold it. Their son was born in the late spring of 1884, on a warm May morning when the prairie was covered in wildflowers that had come up after a particularly wet April, and he arrived with a powerful set of lungs and a full head of dark hair, and a look on his small face that suggested he had opinions about things and intended to express them, which Violet found entirely relatable. Edgar held his son in the careful, completely absorbed way of a man who has been given something that rearranges all his priorities in a single moment, and Violet watched him from the bed, where she was tired in a profound and satisfying way, and she thought that if she had been shown this picture of this man on the morning she arrived in Caldwell, this man standing by the window in the May sunlight, holding their newborn son with that look of fierce and tender wonder on his face, she would not have believed it could be hers, and yet here it was. They named him James Herbert Whitfield James for Edgar's father, who had died when Edgar was 16, and Herbert for Violet's uncle, who was informed of this honor at Sunday dinner and was completely undone by it, and had to retreat to the porch to collect himself, which everyone politely ignored. James grew in the way that good Kansas things grew, fast and with enthusiasm and in all directions at once. He was walking before most people expected him to be, and talking shortly after, and by the time he was 2 years old he had a strong preference for being outside at all times, regardless of weather, and a particular attachment to his father's bay horse, which had aged into a dignified elder statesman of a horse who tolerated the small person's adoration with tolerant grace. The spring of 1885 brought a second set of changes. The cattle markets were shifting, as they always did, and Edgar had been watching the trends with the careful attention of a man who planned ahead, and he had been investing in a better grade of cattle, Herefords crossed with some of the better Longhorn stock, more beef on the bone, more adaptable to the grassland, and this decision was proving a sound one. The Whitfield spread's reputation had grown in the county, and Edgar had begun receiving inquiries from neighbors about his breeding stock. Violet had taken on the correspondence and the record-keeping of the ranch with an efficiency that impressed even the Bricker brothers, who had seen a number of ranch operations and had opinions about their management. She kept precise records of the herd, every animal numbered, every birth and sale documented, the grazing rotations planned out in a ledger that she maintained with the thoroughness of a woman who found order deeply satisfying. She also began a correspondence with some of the other ranch women in the county, an informal network of information and mutual support that proved unexpectedly valuable, and which Edgar observed with the quiet pride of a man who has never doubted his wife's capability, and is therefore unsurprised when it makes itself evident on a larger scale. Herbert's health gave them a small scare in the summer of 1885, nothing serious, as it turned out, a chest complaint that the doctor in Wichita diagnosed as manageable and prescribed rest for, but it prompted a conversation between Violet and Edgar and Herbert about the future of the Rhodes property, and after some discussion, it was agreed that Herbert would sell the land to Edgar, who would incorporate it into the Whitfield operation. And Herbert would come to live with them at the Whitfield house, which had that north room that Edgar had added in 1884, and which was perfectly suited for a stout, red-faced man who needed to be close to the porch and the rocking chair and the family he had left. Herbert was not easily moved to sentiment, but the day he formally agreed to this arrangement, he shook Edgar's hand, and then held it an extra moment, and looked at him with an expression that Violet, watching from the kitchen doorway, recognized as the particular look of a man who is saying with his eyes everything he does not quite have the words for, and Edgar received it with a nod that meant he had understood perfectly. The Rhodes property was folded into the Whitfield spread in the autumn of 1885, and the combined land was something to look at, nearly 1,000 acres of good Kansas grassland, running from the road south of Caldwell down to a boundary that was now several miles from town, bordered on all sides by survey markers that nobody disputed, and managed by a man and a woman who knew every inch of it. They rode the full property line together in October of that year, all of it, the whole outer boundary of the combined spread, which took most of a day and covered a great deal of ground. James, at 18 months old, rode in front of Edgar on the bay horse with a solemn and proprietary expression, as though conducting an inspection that he took seriously. Violet rode Copper, who had grown from a steady bay gelding into a steadier bay horse with a gray muzzle and an entirely reliable disposition. They rode the eastern line along the old creek bed, which had run well that spring and had water in it still in October, which Edgar said was a good sign. They rode the southern boundary past the old survey markers and further west along the new ones. They rode the western edge past the cottonwood trees, which had grown taller still and which in October were a brilliant yellow that caught the light and threw it back in shimmering curtains. They rode the northern line along the road, and they stopped at a point near the old northeast corner of Herbert's property, and they could see everything, the whole spread laid out in the afternoon light, the Whitfield house just visible through the cottonwoods, the smoke from the chimney where Mrs. Donahue was making something that would smell good when they got back. "Do you remember," Violet said, "the first time we rode this line?" "September," Edgar said. "I had no idea." shook her head, smiling at herself. "I genuinely had no idea what you were doing. I thought you were being a helpful neighbor." "I was being a helpful neighbor," he said. "I was also asking you to marry me." Very obliquely. "I thought it was fairly clear." She looked at him with the full weight of her gray-violet eyes. "You were walking me around a fence line." "I was showing you what I was offering," he said. "I thought the direct approach would be—" He paused. "I didn't want you to say yes because I'd asked. I wanted you to say yes because you'd seen it. All of it. The dry creek and the survey markers and the hawk and the winter fence lines. I wanted you to know exactly what you were agreeing to." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land that was hers and his and theirs, and James sat on the horse in front of his father and looked at the horizon with an expression of mild curiosity, and the cottonwoods threw their yellow light across everything. "It was exactly the right way to ask," she said. "I understand that now, better than I did even when I said yes. It was the most honest proposal that has ever been made." He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, and she took his back, and they sat there in the October afternoon at the edge of their land, the whole of it visible around them, and it was one of those moments that doesn't require anything added to it, that is already everything it needs to be. James pointed at something on the horizon with great enthusiasm and produced a sound that was probably a word. "Hawk," Edgar said to him, and indeed it was that red-tailed hawk with the uneven wing, still here, still turning his long, slow circles above the grassland that had been his territory for as long as Edgar had been watching him. "Still out there," Violet said. "Still out there," Edgar agreed. They turned the horses back toward home, toward the warm smell of supper, and the lamplight coming on in the windows and the porch where Herbert would be in his rocking chair, and Mrs. Donahue would be performing miracles with whatever was in the pantry. And they rode together through their land in the last of the October light, the grass golden around them and the cottonwoods burning yellow against the blue sky. And Violet felt the deep, grounded certainty of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. The years that followed were good ones. Kansas changed around them, more settlers arriving, more of the open range being converted to fenced farmland, the cattle drives on the Kishom Trail eventually winding down as the railroads pushed further into the territory and made them unnecessary. But the Whitfield spread adapted, as well-managed land and well-matched people tend to do. Edgar shifted more toward beef production and less toward driving cattle north, which was a sound decision made at exactly the right time, and the quality of the Whitfield-Hereford stock became known in the county and eventually beyond it. Violet managed the business correspondence and records, and also, beginning in 1886, began writing occasional pieces for the Caldwell commercial newspaper about farming and ranching practices, which the editor published with an enthusiasm that seemed to surprise him each time he received one, as though he had not quite expected a woman from a ranch outside of town to be such a clear and useful writer, which she thought said more about his expectations than about her writing. In 1887, their daughter was born, a girl with Violet's gray-violet eyes and Edgar's dark hair and her own emphatic personality, which manifested from approximately the second week of her life. They named her Clara, for Mrs. Donahue, who had been the steadfast and irreplaceable center of their household for 5 years, and who, upon being informed of this honor, made the cornbread that evening with what appeared to be triumphant energy. James, at 3 years old, was cautiously interested in his sister, and went through a period of checking on her in her cradle at regular intervals, with the expression of a small person performing due diligence on a new variable. Herbert watched both children with the contented expression of a man who has everything he needs close at hand, and he told Edgar once, with the directness of a man who has stopped worrying about what things sound like, "I had no children of my own, and I've ended up with more family than I knew what to do with. That's better luck than most men get." Edgar told him it wasn't luck so much as Herbert being a man worth keeping around, And Herbert said that was a very fine thing to say and then went and got more coffee and did not mention it again because he was not built for prolonged sentiment. The children grew. The land continued. The seasons came around again in their reliable order, and each one brought its work and its beauty and its own particular quality of light on the Kansas prairie. The spring green and riotous, the summer hot and alive, the autumn gold and measured, the winter white and serious and finally releasing into spring again. One evening in the spring of 1888, when James was 4 and Clara was not quite 1 year old, and Herbert was asleep in his chair in the parlor with a newspaper over his face, and Mrs. Donahue had gone home to the small cottage that Edgar had built for her adjacent to the property, because she had declared the boarding house insufficient after 6 years. Violet and Edgar sat on the porch in the warm spring evening and watched the last of the light leave the sky. The new fence line on the north pasture was finished, the third extension they had made in 6 years, the property having grown with each good season and each sound decision. The hawk, they still thought of him as the same hawk, the one with the uneven wing, though Edgar said thoughtfully that it might be a descendant by now. The coloring so similar you could not be certain, had been seen that afternoon, still quartering the grassland in those long, lazy spirals. "Do you ever think about St. Louis?" Edgar asked. She considered this honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. "Sometimes," she said, "I think about my parents. I think about what it smelled like after rain, which was different from what it smells like here after rain. I think about the river." She paused. "But I don't miss it. That place belongs to who I was before, and I have a great deal of affection for who I was before, but I don't want to go back to her." "Who do you want to go back to?" he asked, in the teasing way he had learned to tease, which was dry and fond and came from a complete security in things. "Nobody," she said. "I want to go forward." He put his arm around her where she sat beside him on the porch bench, and she leaned into him, and the evening air smelled of grass and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the cottonwoods coming into leaf, and somewhere in the distance a coyote made its preliminary business with the darkening sky. "Forward sounds good," he said. "It does," she said. "It really does." Inside the house, James woke from his nap with some announcement that required immediate parental attention, and Clara added her voice to his in support, and Herbert made a snorting sound from behind his newspaper that suggested he remained asleep through all of it, and Mrs. Donahue's cottage showed a lamplight coming on through the cottonwood trees, and the Whitfield porch held its 2 people in the last warm light of the spring evening, and the land stretched away in every direction around them, known and beloved and entirely theirs. The ring on Violet's finger caught the last light. The gray violet stone, the color of her eyes, the color of something Edgar Whitfield had seen and cared about, and sent a description of to a jeweler in Wichita before he had said a word out loud about any of it, held the fading day for a moment, and then gave it gently back to the dark. She looked at her hand, and then she looked at him, and the years were in his face the same way they were in hers, not as damage but as evidence. Evidence of weather and work and seasons and laughter and arguments about chickens and long rides along property lines in every direction, and 2 children and 1 uncle, and 1 indispensable woman who made cornbread, and a hawk with an uneven wing, and more mornings than she could count waking in this house to this man who had known from June, who had carried the ring in his shirt pocket, while she sat on his porch and thought herself careful, and found she had not been careful at all. Had already fallen without noticing the ground coming up to meet her. "I'm glad you asked me to walk with you," she said. He looked at her. "Which time?" "All of them," she said. "Every time." He kissed her there on the porch in the spring dark, and the prairie held them in its enormous, generous quiet, and inside the house their children made themselves known, and the night came on over Kansas with its extraordinary cargo of stars, and everything was settled and whole and real, and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.